Hello, I'm Jennifer Jackson. This documentary chronicles the events of the Deaf Ontario Now movement. As you gather at tonight's banquet, you'll be celebrating the events that took place 15 years ago, the rally, the protest, and the successful outcomes. The documentary includes interviews with people who were part of the movement, and they'll be sharing their memories as well as their thoughts on the future. So, without further ado, please sit back and enjoy the film. Gary, I'm wondering how the whole Deaf Ontario Now movement began. What were the events that led to you deciding that a committee needed to be formed and that something needed to be done?
Well, at the onset, there was Patty Shores-Herman
Oh yeah,
and
I've seen her
myself.
name.
Yeah, she's the director of the Sign Language Services, and we talked about how establishing courses or presentations related to ASL and deaf culture to teach the deaf community about their rights. And so this is something that developed, and we started to present across the province. And at the same time, Gallaudet University had their deaf president now.
I can see the relationship.
Yeah, so we took and rolled with that.
So you seized the moment and, the mood of the time.
That's right.
But it's amazing, Ontario's so big. How did you reach out to all the smaller deaf communities?
Well, at that particular time, we didn't have the internet or anything like that.
Wow.
So we used TTYs, we had messages on videotape that were spread across the province. We went to the various cities. We went to 30 different towns across Ontario with our presentations. Julio Shankarli and I, who was the coordinator for the rally, and we went from town to town to get that word out.
How many people were on your committee?
It was just a small committee. There were only 5.
Wow.
Patty, Sally Palucci, again Julio Shankarli, Henry Whalen, president of the Ontario Association of the Deaf, and as well as Kirk Ferguson, who was researching. And then there was Judy Rebick, who was the political media strategist. And then also Rick Johnson, who was the MPP for Scarborough West, and he was the NDP education critic, and he was very helpful in advising us on a strategy.
I got involved with the Deaf Ontario Now committee, I think because I knew something really exciting was going on, and I believe I was invited to join some of the meetings and really wanted to have a job to do. So I approached Julio and said I was really interested in taking pictures at the rally to see, so he'd have some memories of what was going on. And he said fine, as long as I understood there was no money for the pictures to be taken, as long as I accepted that, then it was fine for me to go ahead and take pictures and be involved with the committee.
Currently, I'm the chair of the Deaf Ontario Now committee, but 15 years ago I was the secretary. It was a good group, and the original 5 or 6 members have all come back together. It's 15 years later, but I think we look the same. Well, maybe a few more wrinkles and gray hairs, a couple of kids later, but it's been great.
Ontario Now, when Gary Malkowski came to see me and asked if I would, told me he was He told me that he was involved with a group of deaf people and they wanted to organize to demand that American Sign Language be used in the schools for the deaf and just generally that education be improved. And he asked if I would help them with political strategy.
Great. Okay.
In those days, I was the education critic for the NDP. And so as a result of being the education critic, this obviously fit into my area of responsibility. And as people knew me at that time, I was very involved in a lot of social justice issues. And this one was pretty outrageous when you considered some of the techniques that were still being used to force people to learn sign English, which was really not a natural language for people, and some of the problems that the families of some deaf children were having in terms of accepting the cultural aspects of being deaf. So it was a natural thing to take on as a sense of empowerment and to move forward with that. And so
The one thing I remember at the very beginning, at the onset, was people coming to me and asking me to be involved with a committee, and I thought, a committee? Yeah, well, sure. I didn't know what it was for at the time, but I joined, and I didn't realize there'd be so many people involved, and I didn't know what it was about. But there was Julio and Gary and Henry and Georgia, and part of the OAD board was involved in developing this, organizing this rally for Queen's Park for deaf rights, education rights for more teachers, Deaf Ontario Now, and the 6 principles of the policy. And so, well, we talked about it and we decided that we're all going to take on a certain task, and my role was to be field marshal. And I was responsible for making sure that people were safe and secure in the rally, and making sure that there was coordination and communication with the authorities, along with the police as well, and making sure that we had the permits and everything in place for rallying up University Avenue into Queen's Park.
So tell me about Lucy Ross.
Oh yes, well Lucy, she was very involved with the Canadian Association for the Deaf, and she was the secretary for Deaf Ontario Now. She's just great.
Yeah, well, she gave me all of the files and documentation on the 6-point policy and the purpose of the rally.
Right. Yes, yes. The 6-point policy.
So tell me about that.
Well, the first was to recognize within the deaf community that ASL, American Sign Language, was their language, and that they were to use it, and they could use it in the classroom, and the use of interpreters, and basically recognizing that language for the deaf community.
And the second point?
Also recognizing the use of ASL and LSQ, Langue des Signes Québécois, as in language of instruction for the deaf. I know teachers in the classroom use them in the schools, as well as the French school in Ottawa. They use LSQ as the language of instruction.
So it worked. And I know the third point was about the training program, right?
Right. In 1990, York University, the teacher education program, they hired David Mason as an instructor.
Right.
And so they had many more deaf participants, and we've had so many more now. Whereas we had 8 in the past, we now have over 70 deaf teachers in Ontario now.
What a difference, hey? And that talks about the ASL LSQ curriculum. Hey, that's what Heather Gibson's involved in, right?
That's right. Yes, and she's just completed. She's gone from grade 1 all the way, and she's almost finished grade 12 of the complete ASL curriculum, which also involves deaf studies. So that's just great.
And Gary, what does this mean, the deaf advisors and deaf education?
Yes, Jim Roots, he was on the advisory committee to the Ministry of Education, and he was on that for 6 years. And so now it's spread across a bit. David Kerr, he sits on the Special Education Advisory Committee and the Windsor SEC, but we do need more deaf representation, but it is a start.
Yeah, well, it has to start somewhere. Then there's a whole bunch here that talks about recruiting and advertising. I don't get that.
Yes, there's a 5-year plan to recruit more deaf professionals that work in the deaf schools, teachers, administrators, To have a CEO or president such as Gord Royale that's just been hired by CHS, more deaf staff, counselors, management, you know,
That flyer was for the pre-rally party. It took place on the Thursday just prior to the rally. It was held at the Toronto Association of the Deaf, because back then, Thursday night, they always had a social. $2 to get in, and the place was always packed. Many of the staff here at CHS, both hearing and deaf, made a point of going on a Thursday night. Right after work, we'd all head out. Sign language students were welcome, hearing staff came out. It was a great place to meet. So that pre-rally night, we had Gary getting everybody pumped with the Deaf Ontario Now chant. We did all the last-minute stuff about who would do what and where to meet the next day. You could really feel the excitement. I mean, I didn't get out of there until 3 in the morning. Then I had to drive home. I had friends from out of town visiting for the rally. I had to get back up again at 6 in the morning. I remember it was a dull, rainy day, and it was really hard to push myself out, but I got moving, got to Queen's Park, and the place was deserted. But slowly a few people showed up, Julio and Henry, Gary, Judy Rebick. We started to strategize, and we met with Richard Johnston, the MPP, and then deaf people started to turn up. You know, just a few at first, and we were a bit worried that the rain would keep people away, and we wouldn't get the expected turnout. But then more people came out with their umbrellas against the rain, and we've got pictures that we'll share with you. And you know what? We were off. The presentations began, we had the drum banging, we'd modified the Bison song from Gallaudet for our purposes, and the turnout was just great. After the speeches, we took to the streets. There was about 1,000 people there for the march down Yonge Street. Honestly, there was a good 1,000 people, and the whole thing went off without a hitch. We had the municipal permit. It was really great. I want to chat with you about the events of 15 years ago, the Deaf Ontario Now movement and the famous rally that Gary and his team led. I was just a kid, but I remember seeing you in the background. I know you had some influence too. Can you share your memories and your observations? Well, I was over 50 by then, and sort of resistant to the idea of a protest. I didn't like it much. I mean, you saw them everywhere, and I was uncomfortable with the thought of deaf people doing it too. I didn't want that. But I realized that they had their reasons. There were not enough deaf teachers. They weren't hiring deaf teachers in Belleville. Milton was a newer school, and there were a few deaf teachers there, but none whatsoever in Belleville. So I thought, you know, there is a reason to protest, so I accepted the placard that said Deaf Teachers for Deaf Students, and I carried that. I didn't want some of those other slogans, but it was definitely interesting. I'm very proud of the young people that got up to speak that day. You know, in my time, we didn't do anything like that. I think we were more inclined to influence change through letter-writing campaigns. We tended to debate our issues on paper. But, I mean, were we like Gary and those other young deaf men that spoke that day? No, we weren't. What I found most inspiring about the rally was just the sheer number of people who came out. I remember we didn't have room to move. Everyone with their, placards waving, and you couldn't see around them, so you had to ask people to put the sign down just so that you could see. It still makes me laugh when I remember us all shaking our placards and the chair of the rally waving them down so that we'd be able to see what was being said. But then some folks would get riled up and up the placards would go again. You know, it was just the excitement of the moment. Everyone could feel it. It was infectious. I felt like a kid. You know, I remember us with the come on, you know, the deaf rights now. But we did the right thing, advocating the government, showing Queen's Park, you know, come on, do something about this. I liked the placards in terms of the spirit, but you just couldn't see. You had to ask the person in front of you to get the person in front of them to tell some guy up front to put his sign down, and sure enough, some other enthusiastic protester would raise their sign, because as deaf people, we needed to see to understand the presenters. It would have been nice if we'd had a sort of graduated stand, but it was difficult on flat ground. And I liked the song. The deaf chorus really added, I think, to the whole spirit of the day. And I really liked Gary's big signs as he chanted, "Deaf Ontario now!" I loved that. It was all just larger than life, you know. I wish those times were here again, because the work, it just isn't finished.
"15 years ago?"
When the rally, okay. Well, I mean, I think the rally was an amazing experience. I think it was the first time that deaf people had ever rallied on, at Queen's Park. And, it was quite a big rally. It was a very big rally. And we had been lucky because the week before we had held a press conference. And there wasn't a big turnout, but the guy who turned out, his name was Andre Picard from the Globe and Mail. He still writes for the Globe and Mail. And he became very interested and found out about the struggle for deaf power at Gallaudet University in the United States. And so he had written a front page article in the Globe and Mail about Deaf Ontario Now. So when the rally happened, there was tons of media there because it had been in the Globe and Mail before. So I thought it was a terrific rally, but I guess for me the most important experience was that I gave a speech in American Sign Language. I didn't use an interpreter. I signed myself and I didn't talk at the same time. I don't think I'd ever done that before.
The French LSQ deaf people, they came out to the rally too. And in fact, in Sudbury, Roger St. Louis and Linda Scott, representing the LSQ and ASL communities, led that rally. I have a picture here of Roger. The demands of the LSQ French deaf were the same as ours, and they fully supported OAD's 6-point policy. They wanted LSQ recognized, they wanted more deaf teachers hired, exactly the same things that we wanted. So there was great cooperation between the two groups. It really worked.
And so my parents were involved.
Wow, your mom and dad got involved. How nice.
Yeah, they were. I mean, my parents are hearing, they're not deaf, and they're very much hearing, but I wouldn't say either one is fluent in ASL. My father has some homemade signs. He gets by. My mom's, she's pretty good. I mean, she's not bad. But what had happened is I contacted them and asked them if they wanted to be involved. They thought about it, said sure. They came down, picked me up, and we went to Toronto, and we got to the rally, and it was a very large turnout. I mean, when I first saw the people, I mean, it was a pretty good turnout. I thought it was about, say, maybe 1,500 to 2,000
Wow.
people. Yeah, I mean, I don't know exactly. I mean, I couldn't count, but I mean, I would say it was in that ballpark. I would say up to 2,000. So it was a pretty good turnout for a start.
It was an act of hubris. No, I don't know. I'd have to say that we were trying to make an impression. And sometimes in private members, it's hard to even get the attention of the House. It can be fairly raucous. And so in terms of introducing the bill, I thought it was probably important to do something dramatic. It was totally illegal you're only allowed to speak in English or French in the house. You can do a quote in another language, but you have to provide that in writing to the speaker, or at least that's how it was in those days. So this is a different language, and therefore I shouldn't have been able to do it. But so I started my speech by, in a very wooden way, using sign language. And as somebody who'd learned how to speak French, I couldn't believe how hard I found it to speak spatially rather than speaking orally, obviously. And so it was very short because I could hardly hold together the little bit that I did. But it was to make a point, and it did catch the attention of the House, and then we were able to move forward.
I think both. I had been involved with the deaf community already for a few years at that point, and I also had gotten a lot of information from various people I came into contact with about what the education system was like. And it's a bit of a conflict as an audiologist because I really support signing in the classroom. I think really there should be signing in the classroom whether you're hard of hearing or deaf, because it's a good language to have so that you can go back and forth between the deaf world and the hearing world. But I know that's not what happens in the deaf schools or even in the mainstream system. So I guess I did want to see things change so that more children were given the opportunity to learn how to sign, have less gaps in their education, and be more a part of their actual class.
So at 14, I was ready to go into high school. So somehow one of my teachers suggested I go to Belleville, the deaf school. Well, the school for the deaf. Well, my family and my relatives all thought that that would be terrible, to send poor Dorothy to Belleville, to a school where they don't talk and all they do is sign. But really back then you had to use your voice and try to speak. Oh well, that was the beginning of my happy times. The world opened up through sign language. I loved everything about the experience. My friends, the discussions we had, the debates, even the teachers. It was great. It was very good for me. And I stayed there until I graduated at the age of 16 because Belleville only went up to grade 10. And then I got a job. So after the rally, we saw changes beginning to happen. More deaf teachers were hired, some deaf administrators were brought on board. Things were slow at first, but changes were starting, and more deaf counselors were hired. At the schools for the deaf, you could see the difference, but here at the Toronto School Board, the impact was slow to be felt. But it started to change there too, mainly because I was such a strong advocate, because you can't ignore those children. They're still deaf, no matter where they go to school. You have to always remember that. Today things are better, and we have a deaf principal, which is great, and the number of deaf staff are growing. Once upon a time we had many deaf teachers, and we went from that to having basically none at all. But now we see an increase in deaf staff, not to a huge extent, but things look pretty good. It's good. I can see a big change. I really can. The view of deaf education is much better today than it was. Deaf children have deaf role models that they can emulate, including a deaf principal. And it's critical that deaf children can identify with role models. So now that you have your own family, Robert and your son Xavier, who's deaf, when you look at Xavier and you think of your own school experience, you went to the School for the Deaf, senior year at public school, RIT, Algonquin College, you have a lot of experience in work and in the community. What are your concerns for your son's future? How would you like to see the educational system improve for your son? Well, Robert and I want our son to go to the School for the Deaf, but we're concerned about low enrollment at the school. I hope to see that turn around, but I'm seeing many deaf children with hearing parents receiving cochlear implants and then being sent to public schools. I think that means a lot of gaps in terms of their social experience. I want to send my son to the school for the deaf because I believe that's key in terms of social development. If he chooses to go to a hearing school later, that's up to him, but I'd like him to go to a school for the deaf when he's small to ensure his social development. Xavier will always be part of the deaf community here. I mean, of course, we signed to him. ASL is his first language.
I mean, you know, the thing, Deaf Ontario Now, the people on the committee were well aware that that these changes were essential to getting deaf teachers to be prominent in the schools, and that if we could get the changes, then deaf teachers would be able to get jobs and advance. And this was people were very conscious of that at the time. It was a very important part of the demand. So I'm thrilled to hear that it's improved that much. That's amazing.
You know, again, I just think of the Garys of the world who should be standing up with such pride, because those things don't just happen. You make them happen. And people make things happen. And it's that perseverance. You can't get discouraged. You have to keep at it. So when you say 85 deaf teachers across Ontario, yeah, let's go back 15 years. Let's go back 20 years and say, okay, how many were there?
One of the really stunning stats was that there was just a handful of deaf students, and almost nobody in administration who was deaf, and that included people who had gone away and got PhDs and things of that sort. So I think there was one deaf administrator in Alberta, as I recall, during those days, but that was about it in Canada in the education sector. So to know that that there's 85 or so now is great. One of the other areas is that an LSQ, of course, is a minority within a minority in Ontario. There was nobody in Ontario who was trained. All the training for that was done in Quebec, and it was very hard for people, I think, to get work here. So it's good to know that there are people actually with LSQ training who are teaching in Ontario now too. That's very exciting to hear.
Well, my favorite stuff was just, quite frankly, was watching the community become mobilized. Watching the deaf community actually engage with politicians, with the media. You know, once they got involved with the media and understood how to work with the media, that's what I appreciated the most, was to say, okay, now we're connecting the dots. We're getting the dots connected. Now you'll never be able to take the power away from the people. Once they have learned from one another, once you understand how it works, it will move forward. And it doesn't matter who is there. It will now move forward.
My impression as you raise it is the faces of some of the committee members who we've been working with over that time, Patty and Gary and others, and just the joy on their faces. It was that was really wonderful. I mean, I spent all my time was in opposition in politics. I had that wonderful sense to retire just as the NDP came into power, keen sense of timing, and as a result, I had a lot of frustrations in my political life, and the issues I took on were around poverty and long-term issues that are pretty tough to move along. So this was one of the few examples where I actually saw, in the space of just a couple of years, some enormous change and a real receptivity to what we were trying to do. So it was, for me personally, it was one of the highlights of my political career.
Gary, the rally was a new experience for deaf people. What were some of the problems you faced and how did you deal with them?
Well, a lot of the deaf community were afraid to show up and protest because they were afraid of being jailed. And we explained we do have a permit. And so then there was a pretty good turnout, young, old, even Dorothy Beam was there.
Yeah, I remember that.
Yeah, so it was a large turnout. It was very inspiring. And the crowd of us, the people, winding our way from here all the way down, and as a group moving all the way through the streets, all the way over to Yonge Street, and then down to Mayfest. The administration, the public, the police, they were dumbfounded. And there were articles, and there was the media, the spotlight was on us, and at the same time we had this national coverage of Deaf Canada Now. And so the world's eyes were upon us. It was just fantastic.
Wow, that's really a part of history.
Absolutely. It was 15 years.
And it was just the beginning, right?
Yeah, we went from the rally to Mayfest, and certainly all of us stayed at Mayfest that night. And then after Mayfest, we had actually booked a hotel room, and a few other people had booked hotel rooms for us to move on after Mayfest to party and discuss the events.
Okay, and then can I just...
Great,
yeah, okay.
that's wonderful.
And I just, one more thing, which is to say, I'm really sorry I can't be there to celebrate with you. I'm in Australia, so I couldn't come back for it. But I hope everybody has a wonderful celebration.
So I really would like to say a few things. One is that the people who came together during that period were a remarkable group of people, and who threw themselves into the political battle as total novices, most of them, with such passion and enthusiasm that it was virtually an undeniable force that just could not be resisted. And that's a wonderful message to everybody who lives in a democracy. If you have things you believe in, and you believe in them strongly, and that there's a matter of social justice to it, you will be heard, and people will respond to you. And so I think it was a great positive message about the possibility of change. You can't fight City Hall. Yes, you can. You can do all sorts of things if you show creativity, if you show great energy. And so these people I think are great role models for the young people who are maybe in the audience today, who are thinking of us as a group of old fogies. And there will be other battles that you will face, and there's much that you could learn from this wonderful group of activists who some of us who were in positions of privilege at the time, but most of whom were pretty grassroots folks, not a lot of money, certainly no traditional power base, who made some pretty profound changes in Ontario from which the whole society has benefited.
I always have fun music, so it's just the only thing we've seen. Have a wonderful time. That's, it's been a rewarding experience for me working those years with the deaf community. I appreciate it so much. I'm working with the parents. It was just again, it has carried me through many things, and I look back on it as wonderful times. And
I talked to some people, and then I thought maybe I should ask Julio, because he was involved in the initial rally, and I asked him what he thought, and I said, it's been almost 15 years and people are forgetting, well, what do you think? So he thought about it, and then we sat down and had a meeting, and he said, you know what, go ahead, do it, go for it, let's just do it. So I said, okay. So we contacted all these people, got together, and it wasn't the same as the first, though. We had changed, we had gotten older, and it was a lot of discussion and planning, and it was a different energy level than it was in the past, where we had energy brimming over before. Now we had to be so careful and make sure that we didn't make any mistakes, because we wanted to thank everybody that was part of it, the volunteers, the people that made the signs, and there was just too many people and you couldn't mention every one of them. So we wanted to say thank you to everybody and say to everybody, please stand up, take a bow, give yourself a pat, and show your pride. And now, with Deaf Ontario Now, we can see that this is something that we have, It's something that's archived. We'll have it kept for posterity's sake, and you'll be able to remember. That's right, this did happen, and it's going to help me, to help yourself and the community for deaf rights and Deaf Ontario Now. And that was the mantra that Gary always used. And you know, Gary's spirit, he really moved us all across the country. So I just want to say thank you, and I hope that everybody enjoys this evening. And I have to go to a party right about now, so I'll see you later. A deaf premier and a deaf Prime Minister of Canada as well.
Well, I hope tonight, as you watch this documentary, you enjoy this glimpse of the events of 15 years ago. It's a time to remember the rally, to celebrate our successes, but it's not over yet. There's still work to be done. I hope that you're inspired tonight by what you see, and that you take up the challenge to finish that which is left undone. Good night.
You've seen the video presentation of what happened 15 years ago with Deaf Ontario Now and the history that occurred from that. This particular gentleman is a person that has spent a lifetime in his struggle. He wasn't much of a speaker or a politician, but he showed his actions through running, raising public awareness across the province. All over Ontario he would run, getting his word out to the people. This is a gentleman that wanted to raise public awareness about the rights for deaf children and the right to have an education and for access. And this man's name is Eugene Fowler. And he'll tell you about his story, about his experience as a deaf individual and as well as an advocate for the rights of the deaf children and their access to education. I started attending the Belleville School for the Deaf from 1946 to 61. The education wasn't very good. The teachers were all hearing, and they couldn't sign. I would think that perhaps their English may have been at a grade level or a grade 13 literacy level, but their ASL might have been that of a grade 1 or 2.
Right.
And for myself, my English might have been a grade 1 or 2, but my ASL was a grade 13.
So it's the opposite.
And when I finished school, I wanted to go to Gallaudet University, but the school, they told me that I didn't have enough education. I wanted to go for track. I was the first person to participate in the OFSA.
Right, I know, the Ontario track, right?
Yeah, I was the first. And so I wanted to go to Gallaudet for track, and not necessarily for the education, but I was a little disappointed. Luckily enough, my grandfather, who lived in Peterborough, Robert McBrien.
Right, I remember Robert.
He was the president for 27 years for the Canadian Association of the Deaf. And he encouraged me to receive an education.
Which was good.
He told me that I could become a doctor, and I thought, me, a doctor? And he said, well, you could be a doctor, an engineer, and you could become a teacher. And I thought, well, my English isn't that very good, but he knew. He always, he went to Belleville, and he knew about the education there, but he told me that I could be anything I want. And I said I was interested in becoming a draftsman. So I went to the Provincial Institute Trade School before it became George Brown College.
Right.
And I started there in '61, and I went for 2 years. So, I mean, there weren't any English or science classes that I had taken, so I was pretty good at drawing and at math. Those were my two strengths. And so we tried to raise a sort of a booster club to raise some funds for the tombstone for Samuel Green, the teacher at Belleville. And so we tried to raise some funds that way, and I tried to solicit as many people to support us as possible, but we didn't have very much support. It was a little frustrating at times where we'd only get pledges of $1 or $2. So I thought about it for a while, and I decided to change my strategy, and I thought perhaps I could run from, say, Kingston to Ottawa. And so...
From Kingston to Ottawa?
Oh, no, I'm sorry. No, I meant from Kingston to Belleville.
Oh, to Belleville, okay.
Right, sorry. And so I approached the Belleville school and asked them about running from Kingston to Belleville, because right now we weren't being able to raise very many funds, and I thought that with OAD's permission we could go ahead and make those changes and raise some more funds. So I made a pledge form. I showed it to OAD. They said it was fine, and well, they wanted to know what it was for, and I explained it was for Samuel Green's tombstone, and the pledges, were a lot larger then. I had 10 other deaf individuals who were interested in being part of the run, and we approached the board, and that was fine, but unfortunately they all dropped out. They quit for various reasons.
That's right.
And I knew I couldn't do it myself. I thought of OAD's reputation. I'm thinking about the deaf children and their education. I just couldn't walk away from this. I wouldn't want OAD to look bad out of all of this. So those other people, I mean, they had some gall to do that. But
So you went ahead.
I did. And I found it very hard and very, very frustrating. And it wasn't until I got to Toronto where I found it much better. Well, until Whitby. And that's where there was Paul Laundrie and the group there with John Baxter and BJ.
Yeah, and I remember meeting up with him up in Barrie. Chris Konopik by that time was driving for
That's
you.
right. Yeah, Chris.
Yeah, and I met up with him, and my gosh, it was scary to see him. He was so thin. Here he was. He looked so different. I couldn't believe it was my husband. Oh, yeah, I think it's a big difference.
Oh, yes, very much so. When I was doing the Deaf Trek, I stopped at all 3 of the provincial schools, and the Belleville school, knowing that I was living in Kingston, after the trek had asked me to come to the school once in a while to visit. I thought, well, they want me to come and visit. Okay, so I did. And I also went to the dorms and the residences for the boys, and I was so shocked to see how different it was from my day and age. They were starting to do homework at 7 and 8 years old. I was shocked to see them doing their homework and completing it, and their ASL, it was just so different. I mean, the education was much higher.
And how did that make you feel? What was sort of the emotional reaction to seeing how different things were for these kids?
Well, I was surprised. It was just so hard to believe. I mean, they were learning. I didn't think that, my age, that I could learn. I even met some students that were developmentally delayed, and just watching them and their ASL, heck, I thought they were smarter than I was when I was 18 years old. Their education and their ASL, I mean, they had a vocabulary that was larger than mine. They knew words that I didn't know when I was 18 years old. And so I was quite surprised by all of that. Yeah, I was very surprised.
So when you look at deaf kids today, you see they have better educational opportunities.
Well, and that's because, there's deaf teachers and deaf counselors.
So that has an impact.
Oh, it helps a lot. And in my day, we didn't have any deaf teachers.
None at all?
No deaf counselors either.
Right, I remember, nobody could sign. Everybody just spoke. We couldn't understand them, whereas today everybody can sign. It's great. There's deaf counselors and deaf teachers, much better than when we were in school. It was hard on us, but it's really inspirational now to see young deaf children in the system and how much better their education is. So when you look at these kids today, you see that things are better, but you think there's still room for improvement? Oh, sure there is. You can always improve the system, for sure.
Yeah, it looks better. I mean, when I was in school, if there was anything I didn't understand, the teacher would be upset with me. I was afraid.
Yeah, I remember.
And if I asked another student for help, the teacher would throw chalk at us. And if I went to the counselors and asked them for help, I mean, they didn't understand any of this stuff. I mean, these guys were chosen to be counselors because they were veterans, veterans from World War II.
Really? Yeah, he's right.
Yeah, they were vets. So, if I approached them and asked them for some help, I mean, they didn't know what to do, so how could I learn? And then these children, they're very lucky, they're very fortunate because, they have deaf teachers and counselors.
If we had grandchildren, what do you think we would hope for them? We'd obviously want them to go to the school for the deaf, for sure.
Oh, yes. I hope that lots of deaf children go to the schools. I think it's important, with, incorporating the hearing culture and ASL and having, deaf leaders such as principals. It's my hope that there'll be lots of deaf children that receive a better education and that these children can become those doctors and whatnot. And there's really no excuse. I mean, deaf children, they can be doctors or engineers or even the Prime Minister of Canada, maybe even a mayor or a mayor of a small town.
Yeah, we were hoping, that it would be successful, but there were some hard times during the trek as well. It was really heart-wrenching at times, but I wanted to make sure he didn't give up. And then they found out that I might have cancer, which was really upsetting for Eugene. He didn't want to continue the run. But I told him he had to keep going, that was the priority. I was sure I'd be okay, and I'd make sure that I kept him informed of what was going on. And luckily, I didn't have cancer. But, he's a wonderful man. We've been married for 40 years, and he's really a wonderful man who's always thought of deaf children first. So really, you've concentrated on this project, given up many of your retirement hours, trekked across Ontario, and all just to encourage deaf children to increase their educational level.
Yeah, perhaps Paul's next. Who knows? Yeah, I think maybe after Paul, I don't know if there'll be anybody else. Perhaps Paul might be the last.
I know you've always thought about deaf education, and listening to what you were saying, I know that you've also were hoping that you'd be able to come to the banquet, and the committee thought at least we should be able to come out and interview you and get to hear your story. So Dean and I really appreciate your time and talking to us today.
Well, many thanks to you, Lucy, and as well as to Dean, President of OAD, for coming here to do this. Many thanks.
I know that many people look up to you, and they'll be listening to you talk about your dreams and expectations and hopes for deaf children. Yeah, we're really disappointed that we can't go to the Deaf Ontario Now banquet, but
yeah.
Eugene's just too weak. He was very upset. He really wanted to go, but what with the cancer, I mean, of course we wish it never happened, but there's not much we can do. And we try to stay positive.
Yeah, it's unfortunate that I got ill, but I'd really like to go this Saturday.
Yeah, he feels bad. He still wants to run, but
Yeah.
Cancer's really changed our lives. It really has.
I wish I could be here tonight to celebrate Deaf Ontario Now. I hope that everybody enjoys themselves. Who's willing to take up the challenge and run for the cause like I did?